Good afternoon and welcome to St Andrews on the Terrace. Bernard Beckett presented Consistency's Curse at a CFA conference some years ago in Dunedin. And those of us who heard it enjoyed it very much. So the Trust has asked him to come back and give this talk again for those of us in Wellington who didn't hear it. Bernard's biography is in your program sheet, so rather than read it all out, I'd like us just to welcome Bernard to the floor and we'll get straight into it. Thank you very much.
Super, thank you for coming along. This may be like the talk I gave in Dunedin, but I had very few notes then and none now, so time will tell. So I had lunch today in Petone on the way in. I happened to be going, you don't need to know why I was in Petone, it's not where I live. And there was there's a Mexican food chain that has been out there a few months, which I hadn't been into before. And I walked in not really knowing anything about it, and I just bought what was my lunch. And then I looked up on the wall, and it's a franchise that comes out of Australia, and I can't even remember the name of it. But the thing is that if you buy a meal, they donate a meal. So a small portion of the money then goes into this meal donation scheme to places where getting a meal is hard to come by. And they've donated, since they've been up, 1 million or something meals. Anyway, I didn't know that. I just went in and bought my lunch. But as I was waiting for my lunch and reading that, I got that inevitable little, oh, that's nice. Look at me. I'm buying someone else a meal. And of course I got what we have intuitively. I got that feeling of, that was a good thing to do, unambiguously. Just so long as the scheme works and it does actually provide someone with a meal and it's, it's not a marketing scam and all the rest of it. If I take it at face value, that feels like a good thing. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, really, that interesting feeling, that intuitive notion that we all have, that some things are good, and the devilishly difficult task of, one, defining what that means, and two, then working out, well, if we can define good, and moral good in some useful sense, how on earth would we go about actually finding that out? And my background of interest in these sorts of areas is essentially the philosophy of science. That's where I sort of came into my interest in philosophy. And so an interest to me has always been, what beliefs can I line up that feel consistent with, and that's another tricky word. This is, philosophy is immediately about words that are much harder to define than we think on first glance, that is in some sense consistent with what we know of science. And science tells us certain things with a certain degree of authority. And I tend to buy most of them. I tend to buy that the remarkable predictive power of sort of, quantum mechanics does suggest there is something quite regular going on in terms of particles and microscopic particles. I buy the overall picture of evolution, and hence I buy the idea that my mind and my tendencies and my habits have an evolved basis, and my ability to interact with reality has an evolved basis. And I think I buy pretty much, although it's clearly a hazier area, I buy the idea that my thoughts correlate very tightly with my physical brain states. That seems like a reasonably strong sort of piece of orthodoxy. And so I sort of keep those three things in mind. And I'm nervous about embracing beliefs that ask me to throw any of those three things out, because they seem pretty well grounded. I am aware that if I do certain things to my physical brain state, be it via Chardonnay or concussion, that the state of my mind changes. There does seem to be a tight relationship there. I'll take the quantum mechanic folk at their word, because I'm in no position to go do those experiments, but I buy the idea, and I actually think if they weren't as reliable as they said, someone would have told us, and also I'm pretty sure that the semiconductors upon which my computers are based wouldn't work. In evolution, I spent a little bit of time working in the Alan Wilson Centre, a lab up in Palmerston North at Massey a few years ago, with some pretty groundbreaking and world-leading folk, and I buy what they were doing too, and I watched their process firsthand, and it looked to me pretty rigorous. I'm also a school teacher. I run a philosophy club out at Hutt Valley High School, amongst other things, and once in a while, in fact with remarkable, predictable consistency, adolescents will come across existentialism, and they'll come across something like Nietzsche, and they'll get all excited because it has massive adolescent appeal. And so I'm going to sort of start in there. And often they'll come in and go, oh my goodness, there's nothing. There's no meaning, there's no values, there's no moral, there's this abyss. which is what adolescence feels like, to be fair, sometimes, for some of them. And that argument was, as you'll probably well know, the Nietzsche's argument, as I understand it, was very much that, you know what, I don't buy this God construction, but if I don't buy it, whammo, there goes all this other stuff. There goes even being able to talk sensibly about what we mean by good. If you're saying, hey, it's good that that meal contributed to someone else, no, it's not. That's not good. There's no good. There's just things like how we feel and so forth, right? And my argument today is twofold. One element of it is that the Nietzschean argument is sort of redundant, that I would be suspicious of the idea of having access to moral truth without having to abandon a God concept. Even if I was a believer in God and I consider myself an agnostic, I wouldn't be able to get there, I don't think, from there to moral knowledge or a particular type of moral knowledge while hanging on to these sort of, if you like, this tripod of scientific knowledge. I don't think I can bring those two things together. Second part of my argument is it doesn't really matter because we can still have objective moral knowledge. It's just not about moral reality. So who cares? That's sort of the argument I want to put. But I'll start with the first part first. I'm struck by how often I'll meet people who, one, have no religious belief, and in fact sometimes are quite aggressive about having no religious belief, and on the other hand are equally aggressive about defending notions of right and wrong. And not just defending them, but defending them not in the sense of, well, it's what I think or it's what my culture thinks or even what I've evolved to think, but no, it really is wrong. And if you push most people on a sufficiently horrendous example, they'll come back with, no, that's just wrong. Not my culture thinks it's wrong, no, it is just wrong. Someone else's culture thinks it's wrong, bad luck. So, and that is, there are people who are vehemently not relativists, and I'm certainly no relativist myself, but equally absolutely dismiss any sense of a reference outside humanity. And that seems tricky to me. And it seems tricky to me whether or not you accept God or a notion. And it seems tricky for this reason. Let's say there's this thing called truly good. And by that I mean something that is good beyond, outside of human reference. So it's not good because of the way humans are and the way we see the world, it's just good. A little bit like heat or weight or whatever. Things that we think of as having some external reality independent of us. Although certainly we frame them in certain ways when we speak of heat and weight or indeed morality. And the question becomes, let's say some things are genuinely good or bad, evil, whatever you want to say. How could I, in my head, ever come across the knowledge of which was which? And I'm going to start with the idea, well, let's say that knowledge or thoughts are consistent with brain states. So I'm actually asking a question of how could my brain get into a physical state that it is consistent with the knowledge that torturing children for fun is really bad, externally bad. Well, that means some external element of the world has affected my physical state. And the question is, how on earth could that happen? Well, it seems to me that the physical state of my brain is affected by both a sort of an evolutionary history and by a physical history since I've been alive. So I've heard certain ideas, people have talked to me about certain things, I've watched, I've experienced, I've had some thoughts. And all of that was building on the sort of substrate of a set of DNA that I inherited from my parents. Could either of those be conduits for a tendency towards lining up with true moral good? In other words, what say torturing children for fun in the universe is really morally good, not bad? Could my brain have gone the wrong way? Could all of our brains have gone the wrong way? And it's actually a question of saying, is there any pathway, any feasible pathway consistent with science, which is my prior commitment in this case, to lining that up? And it seems to me very, very tricky to think of a way. Evolution seems to be a lousy way, because my evolved brain has responded to those things which have aided over time the differential reproductive rates of my forebears, right? So being able to do certain things, being able to detect different temperatures clearly is highly helpful for creatures on this planet, particularly ones that have evolved, to melt when they're exposed to a furnace or die if they're exposed to cold. So the notion of different levels of energy and matter and me being able to sense them, that information can get into my brain by a very simple pathway, an evolved pathway, an evolved tendency to work that out. Because a sensory system of that type can evolve with a huge advantage. I can reason things out, and that doesn't surprise me from an evolutionary point of view. Karl Popper said that wonderful thing that we have ideas that they may die in our stead, which was a lovely quote. The ability to anticipate, to model, and in fact to think metaphorically, okay, I've never met that tiger before, but I've met other tigers. And what that last tiger I met was so. Or I've never met this animal before, but it has fangs, it's gone awfully still, and it's focusing on me. That idea, it's a similar situation. I'm going to just apply, and I'm going to anticipate, and I'm going to reason. I've noticed that when I drop heavy things on me, they hurt. Okay, I think that's a rule. I'm going to live rule-like sort of a behaviour. All of that makes perfect sense to me. I can see how that evolved. It doesn't stop us dropping heavy things on ourselves, actually. Yesterday I slipped on a ladder. Now, a well-evolved human being would check the step ladder first and notice that all the places were not over the edge of a deck, right? That's what you would do. Impulsive, stupid, she'll be right human being, also evolved apparently, just climbs up there with hedge trimmers, backwards, and then just feels them slam on and spends the afternoon in A&E waiting for stitches. But heavy things fall, you can see that. I can see all of that. But what about moral knowledge? What about some things are good or some things are bad? I absolutely understand how moral instincts would evolve. For we're social creatures, and we see moral instincts, that is, behavioural tendencies, involve in other social creatures. We see, types of monkeys and so forth evolving patterns of, if you do this for me, I'll do that for you. A sense of detecting cheats in a system, a sense of hierarchy, a sense of deference, a sense of obligation, a sense of nurturing, a sense of shared tasks. All of those things, we understand why they evolve, or I can understand how they might have evolved. Knowing how things really evolved is slippery. But I can see the plausibility of it. So I can see why I might have moral intuitions, because we are social creatures. In fact, we are the social creature par excellence. And so we would imagine we have the most evolved social instincts of all. And the problem, therefore, is, well, wait a minute, need those evolved things represent a moral reality? They certainly represent a physical reality of what leads to survival, what constitutes a stable, successful social structure. That can undoubtedly evolve, and I'll get to that later. But should any of those things reflect a moral reality? And the answer would seem to be only if by moral reality we actually mean the pragmatic rules by which social structures flourish. But if that's what we mean, I think that's what we should call morality, right? And that certainly is no longer an external thing. It's now internal to our world. It's now defined by this way human beings are and how they get on. And that type of morality I'm going to suggest to you is eminently sort of discernible, of course, because it's a question about practicality. Massively complex, because social structures are massively complex. How else could it get in? Certainly in very traditional religious systems, and I think of the one I was brought up in a Catholic church, there was no question about that. And that is, it got in by way of miracle. And essentially, some being who was super physical found a way of passing on physical information, be it by commandments or by coming to earth, talking to people face to face. So that might be a way moral knowledge could get in. And so one immediately asks, well, how do miracles sit with science? And I think, well, it's difficult. It's a difficult fit. At least to this extent, and I think we should be explicit about this. It's a difficult fit to the extent that you think science describes a world that is regular. And I think that's a pretty fair description of science. It's entirely true that science cannot justify that assumption. Here we go back to David Hume, right? It's entirely true that we cannot actually know the world's regular. And there's nothing about science. Science assumes it and uses it. Bertrand Russell described it as a necessary assumption by which science is impossible. There's a, I can't remember her name, a current philosopher, who just says anything we can know, we know by induction. And if that's wrong, we can't know anything. And many of you will know the Grew thought experiment out of philosophy, which essentially says, and David Hume set this one up, and it essentially says, imagine that we live in a world where at midnight tonight, everything that appeared blue is going to appear green and vice versa. There's going to be an immediate, and you can choose anything you like, right? That's just an easy example. And Hume made the obvious point, obvious when you hear it, but not obvious in terms of you assuming it in advance, that world up until now looks exactly the same as the world where that inversion does not happen. They both look exactly the same up to now. And if that's true, the evidence in favour of either world is identical. Grew world and our world have the same past. So if you look to anything we've currently experienced to tell us if we're in Grew world or not, there is nothing available. There's no evidence available. How could you possibly know which we live in? We can't. We assume we don't live in Grew world. Every scientific prediction, every time you get in an aeroplane, you assume you don't live in Grew world. You assume that the rules of physics that keep the plane in the air will keep applying. That's science's assumption. And it seems to me, some people would say, well, you know what, that's not really science's assumption. That's a philosophical assumption put on the back of science. But I think that's slightly sneaky. It's the assumption that people make day to day when practicing science. It's the assumption all our scientists, if you like, have made in their collective endeavour to find out things about the world. And it's a huge, to the pointy-headed philosopher, it's a problem. Immanuel Kant said that Hume had awoken him from his dogmatic slumber. And this was one of the cases that he sought to answer. Karl Popper gave a great part of his career trying to answer this problem. But the consensus is it hasn't really been answered. It doesn't seem to be answerable at the moment. So science just has to assume. As in fact I do day to day. I assume that when I put my key in the car, it's not going to turn into a marshmallow that eats me, right? I just assume I don't live in that sort of world. I assume it'll just open the way it always has. Now, if we make those assumptions, if that's what we mean by science, and I think it's a reasonable thing to mean by science, then miracles seem to be excluded. Miracles are saying, actually, you know what, sometimes the rules don't apply. At random, or rather at certain events as determined by my particular faith system, they don't apply. That's a reasonable thing to believe, by all means. But I think we need to be upfront and say, well, what we're doing at that moment is we're saying science sometimes describes the physical world very well, but other times not. And these other times are defined by my intellectual tradition. But if I say, no, I'm just going to stick with science when it comes to describing the physical world, thanks, then the miracles don't seem to be available. The other way out that people offer is, well, you know what, we don't really understand the brain yet. We don't understand consciousness. We don't even know how the brain creates it, which is a fair comment, I think. I think most of the attempts to say, oh yeah, we do, at now, so far, are crashing failures. Imaginative failures, and some of them may turn out to be fecund failures for the future, but nevertheless, thus far failures. I think that's a reasonable thing to assume. And I think there's a certain bloody mindedness about those who don't. Daniel Dennett famously gets quite upset. No, it is just the brain. And some other philosopher says, maybe Daniel's not conscious, maybe there's just some data missing. But the thing is, can we get from, well, you know what, the brain's so mysterious, then maybe there are ways in whereby the brain could sense this external reality, let's say a moral reality, and bring that information in. And I think even if we don't know how the brain works yet, if we commit to the idea that the brain is made of physical stuff and brain states, those physical states correlate, even if they're not causal, that they correlate to mind states, then if information is going to get into my mind, it somehow has to change that physical state of the brain. And I think physics here creates a bit of a hurdle, in so much as it says, you know what, any given physical state is the probabilistic sort of playing out of the previous state. Not entirely causal, because we've got a probability function sitting there at the quantum level, but nevertheless, we say it is that. It's a random probability function. It doesn't have a particular guided pattern to it. Now, some people, including Roger Penrose, have said, well, maybe that physics is just wrong. Maybe the physics inside the brain is different. That's brave, right? And I think that's a fair way around it. But again, I would say what he's doing is saying, let's just put the science on hold for now. Maybe in the brain it's different. Maybe it is. We don't know that yet. But I think a person who says, hey, guess what? I'm going to go with the science on the physical. You often hear this idea of, well, that's religion and that's science and they're different things. Fair, that's fair. Until the religion starts saying things about the science, like, hey, the brain doesn't behave like other nanoparticles, or evolution actually happened apart from a few meddling little moments. At that point, I think you've got to front up and say, okay, here are these moments where they clash. I think science is wrong. And I think if you do that, that's fine. I think that's really honest. And why not? Why not believe what the hell you want to? I've got no paddle to row on that one. But I think it's just useful to say, well, this is what I believe and why. The second part of what I would say is that, weirdly, I don't think it matters much. Because I don't think the alternative to rejecting the external moral reality is actually a sort of relativistic worldview at all. I think it's entirely plausible that we still have moral objectivity. It just doesn't refer to something external. It refers to us in our human physical state. And so I'll just make the beginning of that argument. It's not an argument that leads to moral conclusions, by the way. That's the hard part. But the argument works a little bit like this. Sometimes we make an easy assumption, which is, if this thing isn't referring to something external, it can't possibly be objective. But we have very good examples where that's not the case. People argue about mathematics. Does mathematics describe the real world, or is it just some stuff we made up? So you get your sort of Platonists who go, no, there's a mathematical reality. And others go, no, that's just a system we made up, actually. We made some assumptions, and then we see where those assumptions take us, and that defines different number systems. That's all we're talking about. So let's take numbers and let's say, let's assume they don't refer to some reality. Could we still have facts? And I say, of course we could. It is a fact there are unlimited prime numbers, even if that doesn't refer to some Platonic reality. It's just a fact of the system. If you create certain rules for a number system, then you can produce out of that a nifty little proof that there are infinite prime numbers. Or if you don't like the mathematics example, take something simple like chess. Chess is a game. It's an invented game. It's a human artifact. It's not out there in the ether. We just made it up with a bunch of rules. Once you accept that's what chess is, there are a bunch of absolute objective realities about chess. This does count as a checkmate. You can't get out of this thing. Or this one will be checkmate in 3 moves unless, blah, blah, blah. But you can have all these and you can study it. And you're arguing about facts. It's not relativistic. It's not someone says, yeah, you call that a checkmate. I don't. Well, some people play chess that way. But, tantrums aside, we have this objective basis. This is not to say morality is like prime numbers or chess. It's rather to say we can't immediately assume, just because there's no referent out there, that we can't have objectivity. We can have a form of objectivity, but it is objective relative to our assumptions or our definitions. So, I've done all of this and I haven't defined morality. What do we even talk about? Actually, that's really hard. And people disagree dramatically about what we're even talking about. And that's the difficulty. And it's like free will, I think, not wanting to get too distracted. And that is, a lot of the argument is about a folk definition, which is held intuitively, but is massively hard to actually define what we're talking about. And I think morality is like that too. And I think if we actually make a serious attempt to define what we would even mean by morality, see, some people sneakily say, well, what I mean by reality is what's actually good or bad out there. Well, you know what? If that's what we mean by morality, yes, you cannot have morality if it's not something good out there, right? But is that what we really mean? So we can only ask, well, how do people use the idea of good and bad? How do we use it in everyday life? How does that word function? Does it give us any clues? And I would suggest, and these are not my own ideas, right? These are just gatherings from far smarter people than me, that the key defining feature of morality is essentially the should. It is the compulsion to behave a certain way. And normally it's a should that is defined as superior to even the rules of a system. We understand that what is right might clash with what you're told you should do by authority. So there's this idea, no, there's this other set of rules, and they have priority. So morality is somehow about shoulds. Another thing that's worth noticing is that if you think about the study of ethics in terms of philosophy, the empirical data of ethics is essentially moral intuition. So if someone comes up with a really smart, fancy ethical system and they go, I think I've nailed ethics, this is it, it's utilitarian, that's just what it is. It's the greatest good for the greatest number. The objections to that tend to be intuitive. Someone comes up with an example, well, if that's what the greater good means, then we should be allowed to kill a person, harvest their organs, and save more lives. And one says, no, you can't do that. It's like, okay. And that's usually taken as a flaw of the moral system. It runs up against deep moral intuitions. So morality has got something to do with our intuition. That's how we use it, and it's also how we define arguments, right? And of course, that intuition can be moved culturally, which is where relativism comes in, gets a purchase. But there's a really interesting question about how much it can be moved culturally. How many times in history have groups who have done things we find abhorrent acted with full knowledge, and how often has the abhorrent required a system of propaganda behind it to fool the people, knowing full well that those people had a moral system of intuition that would run up against the abhorrent act? So just how flexible we are morally is a very, really important question. So it's got that notion. The other thing about morality is it seems to be transferable. That is, it's not what I should do, it's also what you should do. People have an instinct to feel appalled not by their own behaviour, but in fact not at all by their own behaviour sometimes, but certainly by other people's behaviour. That's actually when our moral intuitions are at their sharpest, aren't they? When you're being, slightly pious and saying, you people, how dare you do that? How dare you drop litter on the beach? What is wrong with you, So there's a notion of social rules. And I think those things, our intuition, the notion that one should, and the system of social rules give us an inkling of what we mean by morality. Why should I do anything? The answer is probably at some level self-interest, right? At some level. Why should I do anything? Self-interest or lack of choice is why I should do things. And I think that applies to traditional moral systems as well. Why should I do what God wants of me? Because I have no choice, or because I want to. They seem to be the only answers, right? So equally within a system we start saying, well, why would human beings want to follow rules and apply rules to others? And I think the answers are, one, we do have some moral intuitions that are evolved. I think there is a reason at the end of the day that I'm slightly more aggressive towards defending the life and lifestyle of my children than I am other people's children. I think that's evolved. I think that's a thing, And I think moral systems that have asked people to abandon the nurture of their own children for the greater good have hit up against nature again and again. They're hard to sustain, those systems. And the second thing is, well, we're social creatures. For me to live the self-interested life I want to, I need to live in a society that's successfully functioning, or so I see it. Which means the shoulds, for me, in a self-interested way, are about maintaining a society that allows me to flourish. And some sets of rules, it seems to me, are much, much more conducive to that sort of societal stability and flourishing than others. So it seems to me that you probably can get a notion of, but not at the level of detail, but a notion of objective morality without needing any external reference. So long as you accept what we mean by morality is actually society's agreement about how to run society in such a way that the members individually agree, because it reflects also their self-interest. That means an individual can also try to break the moral rules in order to, enslave everybody else, and we can still say that's not moral. It's their self-interest, but one, it clashes against our intuitions, but two, it clashes against our desire for the sort of society we all want to live in. But it's just like the mathematics or the chess example. You've got to define morality a certain way first. But I think it's a reasonable definition, So that's sort of the idea. I think you can believe in a different type of morality, an external referent morality, no trouble, but you do have to give up some essentially held scientific beliefs. Or you can embrace a different sort of objective morality. I think it's really important, that idea. To me, it's very important that you don't have to say, well, if I give up that, I'm stuck with relativism. I'm stuck with anything goes. I think that misunderstands what moral systems are for. And if we have a purpose of a moral system, then we can measure it against that purpose in a way that is in principle objective, but in reality messy. But that's true for all moral systems. You know, do gods want us to eat meat or not, right? It's messy, it's difficult, it's not a simple thing. So that's around about the 30, 35 minute talk, with 10 minutes for you guys telling me what's wrong with it, or asking questions, or just contributing, right? Because I think that's probably the more fun part for you anyway. So I think now's the time to open it up to any questions or contributions you would like to make, and I'll answer them when I can.
I think you said that consistency, observed consistency, we just have to assume.
Yep.
I'd like to think that consistency is measurable, it's observable, and so we take a working hypothesis that the sun will come up tomorrow. We have a theory that calculates that, etc., rather than an assumption. And so it leaves things open then. If you structure your knowledge of science or observed science or whatever, put it together as a collection of working hypotheses, that to me is better than saying it's an assumption, because some things are consistent and therefore we work with them. Tomorrow it might be. Is that
I think I guess there are two elements to that. The idea that they're consistent, therefore we work with them, I think is exactly correct. And that's a pragmatism, isn't it? What else are we going to do? Hume, if I can imagine what he might say, however, he would say there's no way of calculating a probability unless we have assumed consistency first. Right? So it feels highly probable the sun will come up tomorrow. Why does it feel highly probable? Because it always has. Plus we've got an excellent model of why it comes up, etc., etc., etc. So it would take what feels like a vast level of improbability for everything to change tomorrow, right? But what do we mean by a vast level of improbability? We mean that probability is based on the assumption that there's regularity, right? If I talk about the probability of throwing a 6 with a die, it rather depends upon whether or not that's a fair die. And Hume would say we've got no way of knowing whether tomorrow the rules will be the same. The die will be the same. So we can't actually do anything to calculate the probability of the working hypothesis, because probability requires in advance an assumption of regularity. So we have to assume regularity in order to talk about a hypothesis having a probable or an improbable outcome, I think would be his answer, which I find compelling. But I think in pragmatic terms, of course, we work with the hypotheses, we make the assumption. What the hell else are we going to do, right?
Yes, I'm struck by the times that we live in which all sorts of do's and don'ts and rights and wrongs are being re-evaluated. Even science is not obviously exempt from that. In the question of morality, particularly in morality which has been proposed by Christianity and propagated by Christianity, we seem to be shifting from a time when such and such an action was good because Jesus said it was good, to the flip side of that, in which Jesus said that something was good because it was good. So he was following the dictum rather than actually creating the dictum. Do you have that sort of idea also in science? That the rules are changing, where the rules come from, who validates the rules?
In terms of science, the philosophy of science is wonderful but entangled, it's tangled, right? And there's a real continuum by my reading of how people would answer that, philosophers would answer that question. And at one end of that is the idea that there are no rules of science. Science is an activity that justifies itself by its own success. So we do things a certain way in science, not because there's some logical reason that will show the truth, but rather because that's just the way that's worked best. So there's a sociology of science that accumulates over time. And now others would say, no, as we've gone on, we've discovered some really important elements in reality. A great example, off the top of my head, I think a great example is string theory. Because within the philosophy of science, there's a reasonably rampant, as much as philosophy debates get rampant, debate. Because there's a bunch of people, as you may well know, who are enthusiastic mathematicians and wonderful mathematicians who've come up with a theory that, and I'm not going to pretend to understand the mathematics of string theory, so clearly I'm, doing some hand waving here. But nevertheless, a theory that is in the end justified on its own coherence and elegance. It's taken these difficult, disparate problems from general relativity, which is very good at the top end, to quantum theory, which is very good at the smaller end, and as yet we haven't been able to combine them in a useful way. And string theory seems to be able to combine a bunch of things. But how do we know it's right? And the answer from the string theorist is, it must be right, it's beautiful. Everything works, everything fits, it's elegant. And that's like, that's got a lot in common, let's say, with Newton or with the early scientists of that 1700s, where the idea of a system that was beautiful and intelligible was true. Why? Because they were very confident that humanity had been gifted the ability to understand its universe by the Creator. And therefore things like elegance had a very, very high value. But more latterly we've said, no, science is skeptical. Show me the evidence that your beautiful theory is any better than any other. In other words, you've got to show it's testable. Until it produces a testable outcome, it just doesn't count. It's just a beautiful piece of mathematics. Now, it's not as if the scientific community has gone, oh, well, science works this way, so you guys are wrong. Rather, it's split. So I think exactly that point of the rules changing, there are wonderful examples of that. Is that we like to think, no, science is empirical, always. But then you will find branches where some people are hell-bent on leaving the empirical behind and saying, no, we've got to the stage where we can now theorise well beyond our ability to measure or observe. Let's keep going. And others are going, no, you're now just playing mathematical games. And there's no one who comes down as arbiter and says, oh, well, I've looked up my book of rules and science says. So I think, if that's in any way relevant to your question, I don't know if it is. But that's what springs to mind.
I'm finding it very difficult to put a question together because I'd love to hear more about where your thinking is taking you in a sort of wider context. So this will probably come out in a rather incoherent way, but
that's fine.
What you've just mentioned about string theory, one of the things I think I understand about where that's heading is multiverse theory, which then completely puts the whole search for the grand theory of everything disappears. So science is left with this conundrum. If we want to explain everything, we get certain things from string theory, but not everything. And then it opens up to this whole enormous concept of reality that is being challenged on every level, not only quantum reality, but we've got the digital worlds, we've got augmented reality. And my interest is, I think that gives lots of potential for conversations with religion and science that are not about the old battles about evolution and where we've seen the conflict. And I think what I'm trying to ask you is where this goes, in that you come from a Catholic background. How can we move some of these things? Because I think all the traditions bring something that we shouldn't lose. Science is offering something. But you've also talked about, what I get confused about now is that the interdisciplinary aspect of everything. I learned about, I'm learning about new things all the time as we go into genomics, we go into, where we're going with all these things. Behavioural economics, that was the thing I heard of. We don't have barriers between the humanities, the sciences, just with the philosophy of religion. We've got anthropological aspects, sociological. Can you, in 2 minutes, find a question in there that...
Yeah, sure. There are a bunch of things. Look, I respond really strongly to that idea of what do we rescue. That the idea that there is a... at the end of it, this is value-laden stuff, right? My response to my own personal philosophy now has got an awful lot of fact to do with the fact that I'm a parent. There's no escaping that. It's not a... It's not a slightly, removed, austere, objective study of what's true at all. It's very pragmatic. It's like I've got these little kids, they're moving into the world. What sort of world do I want them to live in? and parenthood, as many of you I'm sure know, grandparents even more so I'm sure, you know, it's a very nostalgic act because it takes you back to your own childhood, you know. There's that sort of old dictum that everybody, you know, says they have the worst parents in the world, but they all want their children to grow up much like them, you know. And so you know, you start looking to that notion of I need to be able to teach my children something about a pretty inflexible notion of right and wrong early on, which they can then examine later. But it's no good saying to the 6-year-old, I'm going to explain to you relativism. You know? In the end, it's all about, no, it's not. Be kind to people. It's that simple. You know? Why should I be? You just should. So there's that sort of notion of wanting to rescue. And I think in New Zealand, we're very, very lucky in the sense that, you know, although there's something horribly bland about our rush to the middle ground, I'd rather be here than the United States where, you know, as far as I can tell, you're in one of two diametrically opposed and sort of warring theological camps. And you're a liberal or you're conservative and the other side is stupid just because, you know, I think there's another impulse in me which is about productive dialogue, you know, and that notion of, as you say, you know, and a number of people sit here, there are these wonderful traditions of kindness or love or whatever you want to call them, and finding a way to package them for each new generation must be humanity's biggest task. You get that wrong, I think, and the moral system doesn't work. And if people are sufficiently cynical about it, the moral system doesn't work. And so there's that element. There's another thing that comes to mind when we talk about the multiverse, and I'll just say this briefly as an aside. I was interviewing, I've forgotten his name, was it Peter Ball? He wrote a book called Invisibility. He's also called the Third Reich, physicist in the Third Reich. And he's about to go off, he's telling me in the green room before, he's going to write a book on quantum theory. But his interest is historical always, and sociological. And he's interested in where do ideas come from. And and it's just going to be a great book, I think. I'm certainly going to be fascinated. He was really interested in when we got the Copenhagen sort of, you know, interpretation, we got the first, hey, here's quantum physics, what's it about? He was interested in what was, if you like, the sociological background. You know, a world war brewing, one gone. The seeking of certainties, blah, blah, blah. And he's essentially saying that the interpretations that people jump to with quantum physics, his argument is, are sort of historical artifacts. He's very, very cynical about things like the multiverse. He says it sort of makes no sense, but we love the spookiness of it, you know. I can't escape, and this is just my own background, I can't escape a deep attachment to the notion of testability. That there's something innately different about a theory that someone can show me works better than any other theory. That's what feels like science to me. Whereas, hey, this might work. It's just a possible way of looking at it. I feel like I'm into a different field. I'm into, literature, which I also have a great love for. But I'm actually just creating patterns at that stage. But at the point where I can't decide between them, it doesn't feel like science yet.
We need to finish the formal part here. Other people may want to stay and ask Bernard more questions, depending on how much time you have, Bernard. But I want to thank you very much. In your blurb, it's the first time I've seen the word passionate and agnostic together, and I'm going to ponder that for a while. And it's been very stimulating to hear how you're working through your ideas and the things you're standing by, and therefore what sense they make when combined together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, my very great pleasure.
Thank you for your time.